Right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Irrational M&A, Tackling Cognitive Bias in M&A Decision-Making, supporting the launch of our buy-side M&A Thought Leadership Series. I'm James Worrell, a partner in the corporate team here at Royds Withy King, and I'm delighted to be joined by Brett Newland, a partner at M&A advisory firm PCB Partners, and Professor Scott Muller, the director of the M&A Research Centre at the Business School, and formerly Managing Director in M&A and Private Equity at Deutsche Bank and Morgan Stanley. Firstly, some quick, the usual housekeeping points for webinars. We're hoping for a very fluid and interactive webinar, so do submit any questions that you have using the chat feature on the right-hand side. We have moderators on hand who are looking at the tech side of things and looking after them for us, and we'll be collating the questions that you submit for us to then answer later on or at the relevant point during the presentation. Any questions that are submitted will be seen only by the webinar admin team. Also, we'll be running a couple of polls during the webinar, so please do respond to these to inform the discussions, which should only take a second or two to prompt some good debate. After the discussion, we'll be having a more formal Q&A session during which we'll pick up any questions that have been asked during the webinar that we haven't got had an opportunity to answer on the way through. There'll also be an opportunity to virtually raise your hand and request to speak. If you have a question you'd like to raise in person, you'll see a button that looks like a hand above the chat window, which you can press to put your request in to do so. If you'd like to ask that question in person, you'll need to have your camera and microphone on, and then then you'll be able to submit your questions in person, and these will supplement the questions that are submitted during the webinar via the formal chat function. Today's discussion is going to be captured in a white paper about unconscious biases and their impact on M&A transactions, and we will be emailing a link to all attendees following today's webinar. You'll also be able to download a copy from our website, www.roydswithyking.com. The webinar is being recorded, and we are planning to release it as a video on our website at a later date. So, by way of formal introduction, today's webinar starts the launch of a new thought leadership series that we've labelled Project Headroom. So I suppose the first question, why Project Headroom? And I think for us, there's a lot of content in the M&A markets about the technicalities of M&A transactions, whether it's relating to transaction structure, tax structuring, post-completion integration. And I think in our experience, that's especially true when it comes to market content and advice for sellers within M&A transactions. But I think what we at Royds Withy King have observed in recent times is the impact of the lesser talked about psychological aspects of M&A transactions, but from a buy-side perspective, and the effect that these matters have on decision making and the prospects of the transaction itself and whether it'll be successful. You see the obvious psychological aspects that are apparent during the transaction negotiations, whether it's the additional pressure and stress felt by a buyer's executive team having to balance the competing demands of the existing day job alongside an intensive transaction process, or it might be a first-time buyer nervous about asking the right questions during the commercial due diligence process. And it's for that reason that we've labelled this series Project Headroom. But what about the subconscious psychological aspects of transactions? In life, we're all subject to unconscious biases in our decision-making processes, whether it's strategic planning or recruitment in a business context, or purchase decisions in our day-to-day lives. And this is something that's being more and more recognised in the corporate world, with lots of unconscious bias training, particularly in the context of recruitment. But these biases also, they're prevalent in M&A transactions and M&A decision-making. And so, for the first topic in our Headroom series, we at Royds Withy King, in partnership with PCB Partners, wanted to explore this topic in depth, and that's why I've engaged with the Business School, and particularly Professor Scott Muller, who's the leading M&A academic, to look at the topic. We're delighted to have Scott with us today to share his thoughts, and with that, I'll hand over now to Scott, who's going to start by decoding some M&A urban myths. So, Scott, over to you.
Great. Thank you very, very much, James, and Brett. I know you'll be jumping in here as well, and I do welcome everybody who's here. I do see that there's a fair number of us who who are on here right now, and especially a special welcome to anybody from CAS the business school formerly known as Cass, who's here as well. What I wanted to start off with is I wanted to talk about what I'd like to call the urban myths of M&A, because there's a lot about M&A that people think that they know to be true, that in fact isn't true. And this, of course, ties in very well with those conscious biases that James did ask us to talk about, and which I will be talking about during the day today that we're here. One of those interesting urban myths, I think, is what people feel about how successful M&A deals are. And I guess just to start off, and also just a way to get everybody kind of involved in the chat here, is I'd like to put a poll up to start off here. And this is a poll just asking you, whether you think deals are successful or not. Now, before I put it up, and before I have somebody who says, I can't answer that unless you tell me how you define success, I want you to use your own definition of success. Probably everybody who's on the call here has engaged in M&A in some way. So think back on the deals that you've done, think back on the deals you've observed, think about the deals that you may have read about. And let me open the poll here now. What percentage of M&A deals do you think globally are successful? In one of these four bands here, less than a quarter, between 26 and 50%, 51 and 75%, or 76 to 100%. I'm watching the poll slowly building up. I think it's kind of come to a steady state here. So let me end the poll. And can I just ask James, can you see that poll? Just raise your hand if you can see it. Yes. Okay. So obviously, as we have here, most people think that somewhere between 26 and 50% are successful. And in fact, that's interesting because that seems to be the way that most people do think. That's an urban myth, however. There seems to be a consensus out there that something like 70% of all deals fail, and I guess that would be somewhere around that. In other words, that only something like 30%, 25 or 30% are successful. And that does seem to be the largest group here. I am encouraged, by the way, by the fact that 5% of you here do think that somewhere close to the top 76 to 100% are successful. And by the way, I guess you're the people whose deals I would like to invest in. So please do let yourself be known to me, on that, or to anybody else who might be on the call here on that. But I'm just going to, and I would add, I guess I can leave that up there. I don't know how to get that poll, of the webinar here on that. But the real data is in fact not that. And it does turn out that it's about the same rate of success as flipping a coin. It's somewhere right around 50%. Now, for all of you who said it might be something between 26 and 50%, in other words, that deal failure would be something that might be, somewhere between 50% and 75%. You are suffering from one of those urban myths that, in fact, at one point in time was correct, but isn't correct anymore. That does bias, perhaps in an unconscious way, perhaps the way that we're approaching deals on that. As I said, here, at the M&A Research Center at the Business School, we've looked at 10,000 of the largest deals. That's in a project that we did together with Willis Towers Watson. And we found that the number of successful, the percentage of successful deals was 53%. So those of you who are in the 28% that said 51 to 75%, perhaps you've read some of the material that we published from that, but it is slightly greater, than the success rate of a flip of a coin on that. Some of the deals can be spectacularly unsuccessful, and that's one of the reasons why, in fact, we have that bias because those tend to be the ones that are being discussed. You know, the 97% market share loss of AOL Time Warner after they did it, probably the most spectacular M&A deal failure ever. Those of us here in the UK will, of course, remember RBS buying ABN AMRO, and the ultimate outcome of that, you know, together with other factors, led to them basically being nationalized, or even HP buying Autonomy for about 11 billion and then writing it off several years later, or just a couple years later, for writing off 8.8 billion of that value. These are spectacular deals, and they make the front page of the newspaper. And that's one of the reasons why, because those are discussed so much and they are spectacular, that we have that bias then against looking at those that are successful, that may be on the front page of the newspaper on the day that they're announced. It may be on the front page of the business section of the paper, you know, when the two companies become one. But otherwise, there's nothing really exciting about what's going on with that particular deal, and therefore it might not be dominating the business news the way some of those failures might. Now, there are, if you were to click on to Wikipedia and look at unconscious biases, or look at what's called behavioral biases, or, you know, within the business school, we call those, you know, the factors that really make up what is the whole topic of behavioral finance. If you did look on Wikipedia, you'd find close to 100 different unconscious biases that we suffer from. James was mentioning some of those, and in some aspects of what takes place just in normal business or even in normal life, whether you're shopping or whether you are making an HR hiring decision. We do need to make sure that we're not suffering from those unconscious biases. We've looked at those from an M&A perspective and have identified what we call the big three at this point. Let me go through those quickly in turn just to explain what they are. The first one is what's called the overconfidence bias. You also might refer to it as excessive optimism. You may refer to it as hubris. Perhaps if we think about the current events of today, there may have been excessive optimism on the part of certain political parties or candidates in the United States coming into where things are. And of course, we've all woken up to a non-result on that one. Within M&A, overconfidence tends to take place in the beginning of deals and also towards the end of deals. The beginning of deals, you end up finding that boards and CEOs are overconfident about their ability to be successful in M&A deals. And that's even more surprising because most of them probably do think something like 70% of all deals fail. As I say, that's overly pessimistic. But even if they had the correct figures, that 50% of M&A deals add, for example, shareholder value, which is what we were using as a criteria on that particular study, you would want to go into the deals perhaps with a bit more considered thought, looking for perhaps some unbiased advice. And this is, of course, one of the major reasons that M&A deals do require the use of independent advisors, you know, at all stages throughout the deal, in order to be able to help those who may be suffering from the unconscious biases of, for example, in this case, the overconfidence, you know, or the hubris that you have here on that. The other place where this overconfidence comes, as I say, to relate to the ending of a deal, you know, is whether in fact they're going to be able to achieve the synergies that they project. So many deals are justified, especially on the pricing side, by the ability to be able to achieve synergies by putting two companies together when the two become one. There was a study by McKinsey done back about a decade ago, and they said that 70% of all expense synergies were in fact not achieved. So that's overconfidence and the ability to be able to squeeze out those savings that in fact weren't there. Excuse me, 70% of all revenue synergies were not achieved, 40% of all expense synergies not achieved. And that, of course, makes sense because one has more control over the expense synergies than the revenue synergies. But again, if you look at the data there and the data is out there, you might want to spend more time thinking about whether, in fact, you have some bias on that. Now, let me just pause there for a second. Brett, just to bring you into the conversation here, overconfidence bias or excessive optimism bias, have you seen that in some of the deals you've worked on? Brett, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. Is that better? So the example I'm going to give is where I think I've seen all three of these things manifest themselves in this deal structure I'm going to outline for you. I observed a deal where the company bought a stake in a software business, whereas part of that deal, they were going to sell a large number, multi-million-dollar number of software products as part of that deal. And that was to do two things. Part of the value that was going into that deal from the acquirer of the stake effectively was that it would help the other side grow their business in other areas. But from us, it was more about using that as a conduit to sell lots of other stuff in this very hot market that we thought it was. So now, if they didn't sell those software licenses, then there will be a write down in the books. I think in terms of overconfidence, there was a really strong relationship with the owner of the business that we were taking a stake in. And the guy that had that relationship, was really good friends with this guy. And that didn't help in the conversations in terms of the objectivity point. And there was also overconfidence, I would say, in the institution that I was working with, in that they could get this deal done in the way they envisaged it on the way in. So overconfidence in the ability for the institution itself to deliver on its promises to itself effectively. And then, also, from a confirmation bias point of view, again, it was, this is a hot market, we should be in it. There are other players, but we like these guys personally. We are this fantastic company with this amazing client list and all these amazing people. It's going to be impossible for us to fail. And of course, that doesn't normally lead to successful outcomes because there was really no strong and coherent plan. And again, that plays into sort of the illusion of control. The business thought that because they were who they were and because of the network they were selling into and because they thought they were pretty good at what they did, and they are, that they could control the controllables. And of course, you can't control the market. There are other players in that market that were eating their lunch as such. And more importantly, you couldn't control the individuals selling the product in the ground, in the trenches, all over the world, which was the original plan, because they weren't incentivized like that, and they weren't the software reseller. They were a consulting business, and they weren't geared up to culturally or operationally to sell product standalone. So basically the outcome of that was, so all those overconfidence bias, confirmation bias, and illusion of control bias all played into a deal all the way through the deal, actually, not only on the way in, but on the other side as well, when the transaction was signed. And what the outcome of that was missed financial targets. So they missed some of the individual targets that they'd met themselves. They had an unhappy customer or company on the other side of the transaction, if you like, because they were sold a value story that just didn't come to fruition. And then you had some elite executives in the firm who were getting dinged personally with bonuses, etc., because they weren't hitting their targets. And the other big thing for the business was they thought that was a huge lost market opportunity. You buy businesses sometimes just to get ahead of the market, and they didn't do that. They kind of lagged behind the market because they were putting all their eggs into that basket that ultimately was just a bad deal from the start.
great. Thank you. Thank you very much. You also anticipated a number of things, so I can actually refer back to those deals. But it's but great to hear about that. James, do you want to just add in a deal that maybe you saw some of this?
Yeah, certainly. I think the one that certainly springs to mind in terms of overconfidence is I've been involved in sort of a few transactions sort of over the years, and I think from a buy side perspective, as buyers, sort of the mindset is often looking at the deal itself, but also then the headspace moves to thinking about the post completion integration of the target business with the buyer's existing group, and what's that going to look like in practice. And there tends to be a significant focus on how technical integration works, systems integration, IT systems, things like that. But I think what we have seen certainly more than once is buyers perhaps demonstrating an overconfidence in terms of how that cultural integration will take place post completion. And sort of particularly relevant thing about sort of transactions where you've got a buyer that is concluding an M&A transaction process, particularly to acquire a target, grow, expand into new geographies, and so buys a very clearly defined target business within a geography very different from its own. The target is a very standalone entity, but with a very standalone corporate culture and human culture as a result within that organization. Sort of it has the technical way that it does things, but also the people way, the personable sort of way that it operates, and the cultural within the organization's offices itself. And I think we've sort of seen buyers sort of very common, that'll sort of work itself out, or sort of, we've got a great corporate culture, they've got a great corporate culture, they'll mesh together nicely. And that's just not necessarily always true. They might well be equally great corporate cultures, but very, very different at the same time. And that overconfidence I think perhaps leads to not putting enough time, effort and focus in the run up to the transaction, whether it's looking actually as part of the commercial due diligence phase. Will these organizations mesh together post completion, or is that shift in the cultural dynamic within the group caused by it going to lead to the loss of key individuals within the business, and the knock-on consequence that has on delivering the forecast financial targets projections post completion? So I think that's certainly the one that sort of springs to mind. I think we definitely see in practice a degree of overconfidence by buyers, in respect to that in the market.
Great, thanks. Again, good, excellent examples just on that, and anticipating as well. Again, some of what I want to get to are just two other biases. That overconfidence bias does drive so much very often, because of course the people making the decisions have been very successful. You don't get to be a CEO of an organization, you don't get to join the board of an organization that's making a decision as to whether to proceed with a deal, without having been very successful in your business career, and probably in your life in general. So you think that you have you're bringing that same success into the decision making with M&A. But of course, most businesses, even serial acquirers, that's not their main business. Unless you're a private equity firm, buying companies is typically not your, the key success factor that has made your company successful over the years. It might be contributing to it, but typically there's something else that has made that company successful, and that's what you've been most successful at. Thinking that you can bring that success into the M&A world is that overconfidence bias. The second bias, which I'd like to just mention, is what's called the confirmation bias. This is in fact where you seek information that confirms your preconceptions, and you tend to ignore information which is contradictory, that contradicts whatever that initial belief is. And this is also one which is seen quite often in M&A deals. I know I saw it throughout my career doing M&A deals. A CEO wants to see a deal go forward. A CEO is the one who has dreamt up a deal. The board has approved it. The organization will tend to seek out and search for information that's going to show that that's the right deal to move forward on, and perhaps discount information as being irrelevant, or for whatever reason, information that would lead to a conclusion that says that deal shouldn't go forward. who wants to be the one to bring the bad news to the CEO or the bad news to the board, especially if in fact there's been a lot of time and effort spent on getting the deal to that particular point. And this confirmation bias is particularly important as you get closer and closer to the point where you're going to announce the deal and make it public. And in fact, one way to try to avoid the confirmation bias problem, is to put in some circuit breakers in the deal process, where you are looking at that, or indeed some companies even put together what they call a blue team that will look at how the deal might not succeed and make a case for the deal not proceeding forward. But confirmation bias is one of those elements that exists in most every deal. Because remember, you've got deal teams that have been working in some case for 3 or 4 months or maybe even longer. You've got advisors who've been working with them on that. You've spent money on trying to get this deal to that point. You almost want to see this deal happen, and therefore you're looking for those things that will in fact support it, and not those things that are going to cause it not to be there. Actually, just here in my office, one of the things that M&A advisors love to have, I've got a couple behind me here. Maybe I can even grab one. These little lucite's that you get at the end of a deal, the trophies that you get at the end of a deal. I've got a couple shelves here in my office. I'd like to be able to show the students that and say, this is in fact what you actually do after you've had a career in M&A. You've got a shelf of all these about every single deal. You don't get one of those if the deal gets canceled. You therefore are looking for ways to be able to make sure that that deal will go through, and you'll end up having those little trophies to be there. Just to pause before I say a little bit more, even though you've led me into it, Brett, on that about the third bias on illusion of control. Would there be anything, Brett or James, you'd want to give it as an example just on the confirmation bias?
Yeah, I can give you another one. I've seen that lots of times, and that's kind of it's like the strongest personality in the room, or the most senior personality in the room would allow this personality in the room kind of concept. So where you kind of there's a deal that's being done or in the process of being done, and you've got a lot of people around the table saying it's probably not a good idea to do it for lots of very good reasons. But it's a bit like the hunch kind of analogy you've used earlier on. It was that and the overriding, overbearing personality that got that deal done ultimately, despite it not being a fantastic deal in the consensus form around that entire table. So I have seen that, and a lot of it is because there's, I suppose, the fear of challenging the person who who knows everything, usually the CEO, right? Or the CFO in some cases, but rarely it's usually the CEO because they've got the biggest personality. So I've seen the same thing. And what normally happens at the end of it again is, in the long run, in the very, very long run, I've seen some of these conversations land very well, but the majority of them don't. They cause an awful lot of short-term pain and aggravation. And ultimately, sometimes those deals just have made it through to the very end through pure luck rather than any kind of judgment, because something else externally has changed that wasn't known at the time that the deal was signed.
James, did you want to?
Yeah, I think I'd certainly add from a legal perspective. I think one of the sort of the points I sort of see it absolutely manifest itself is that almost the emotional attachment to the transaction itself. And obviously we see as part of when on the buy side conducting a legal due diligence process, fundamentally we are mandated to analyse the target group, looking at areas of particular legal risk for the buyer, reporting on those, looking to identify contractual protections, legal solutions to those. And you get sort of the red flags that emerge early on in that process, sort of reporting to a buyer, to a client on, and find a solution to it. You do sometimes at an early stage in a due diligence process find what's potentially a showstopper for the transaction itself. And it either forces the deal structure to be recut in another way to mitigate that risk, or the deal to not proceed because the buyer will not take that commercial risk as part of the transaction. But I think what we do see is sometimes those sorts of issues present themselves much later in the day when everybody has been working for 2-3 months on the transaction. Something emerges which, as we would say, often speak about, say, if you'd have known that at the start, would you be proceeding with this transaction? And the answer is sometimes no. But there's a perception we're so far down the line, our future planning all hinges on, we've built a strategy around getting this transaction done, growing into these markets, that you end up overcommitted to that transaction and disregarding something which, if it had come to your attention earlier on, you'd have paused and thought twice about the transaction. And I think on the legal side, you'll often see these issues emerge, and it's often seen as a silver bullet solution. If it's the sort of issue, you can seek a contractual indemnity within the share purchase agreement in relation to, we've got an indemnity from the seller if something goes wrong, we've got a contractual remedy, which isn't a commercial silver bullet to the issue. There's you tend to say post completion, you don't want to be having to re-pick up all those hundreds of pages of legal documentation, start suing the counterparties involved for an issue that you knew about before completion, particularly where it's not guaranteed that the financial remedy will be a genuine commercial remedy to the issue that's arisen. But there's a perspective of, we want to get this deal done, we're committed to it. Yes, there's an issue, we've got an indemnity, that's the silver bullet solution, let's crack on. So I think we definitely see that in practice.
Great, thanks on that. Thanks on that also. Which again, I mean, you guys are wonderful in terms of leading onto the next thing that I wanted to speak about, because the third and final bias of the 100 that are out there, but that the third one that we think is one of the top 3 within M&A is the illusion of control, where in fact those CEOs do think, or the boards do think, that they will be able to control the deal, when in fact outside events could perhaps be much more influential on the success of that deal than what the two companies merging together will be able to do. Very interesting, that the largest deal volume in a September in any year for the past 3 decades took place this past September globally, okay, in the middle of a pandemic, and also many of those being very, very large deals. And in fact, the mega deals had higher volume than we've seen in 3 or 4 years, during the third quarter. Is that in fact perhaps the best example I can give of where companies feel that they have control over what's taking place, as opposed to looking at the market generally and looking at the overall conditions that are there. This illusion of control is one also where, well, when you think about it, with close to 50% of all deals failing, and in fact, even the conventional wisdom, the urban myth out there, that it might be something more like 60 or 70%, of deals fail, we still have so many deals taking place every year. In fact, there's 25 to 30,000 deals that are announced and closed every year. That's a massive number of deals where people are thinking, and this is the important point about illusion of control, this time it will be different. One of the most dangerous phrases perhaps in business, because the companies do feel that they will be able to beat those odds. And perhaps this is the greatest reason, to get some independent advice, or perhaps to have advisors who have as a role to make the arguments against the deal taking place, as opposed to those who are there, again, together with the overconfidence bias, and also the confirmation bias, that drive these deals to completion, despite the fact that in the case of probably 50% of them, they shouldn't have completed, on that. So I guess that's probably a good place. So I've talked about 3 different biases, the confirmation bias, the illusion of control bias, and of course the overconfidence bias. In terms of these deals, there are other biases as well. We have mentioned some of those in the paper that will be available to you. That paper also talks about what point in time during each deal these biases tend to be manifested. So do look at that. But let me pause there. Brett, maybe you could have some final comments just about these three biases in general, or James, and then we can go to some Q&A. I'm just cognizant of the fact that a number of questions have come in, and wondering whether, in fact, this would be a good time to open it up, after the two of you said some comments as well.
I'll try and be rude. Yeah, so I've got my microphone on there again. Yes, I think I've seen all those traits, those three key traits in all of the deals, over the years I've done, in terms of not only sort of some of the sort of V&A transactions, but also some of the much larger operational transactions that I used to do in my old job. And what I kind of observed over time was that some of these companies are getting better at observing those things, and it comes with practice. They have to go through, especially some of the serial acquirers that acquire businesses, all the time. They have to go through this a number of times and get hurt a number of times in various different ways before they come to realize that some of these biases exist, and they put in processes and people and the advisors and all the other stuff to try and, as best they can, counter some of those biases. But it's still prevalent. I mean, we're working on a deal right now where the other side hasn't got an advisor, and that's causing all sorts of problems, because they haven't got. I mean, when you sell a business, especially as an owner operator or a founder at the sort of the mid-market level, you only sell it once, and you've got one shot at getting it right. On both sides, because you don't want to upset the buyer, and obviously the seller needs to get the right kind of advice to be able to execute a proper transaction. So, and to navigate through all these things as they emerge. So that's really important. So I mean, that's kind of the takeaway of this is that I think if you analyze each of these things, you'll recognize these traits in every deal anyone has ever done. And for people who are thinking about buying their business, selling their business, or even inexperienced buyers of businesses, just get the right advice, objective advice. Appoint people in your business that are objective and have got the strong enough personalities to manage their stakeholders. You might think this is a good idea, and some others might think it's a bad idea. But also make sure that you've got people on the other side of those transactions empowered and engaged and incentivized to ensure that these deals get done properly, because there's loads of things you will never be able to control, from rogue CEOs that have been bought by companies, right, who just are not what they said they were, to the companies themselves not being what they said they are. But as long as you've taken all the necessary and appropriate steps along that journey, getting the right guys in to help, then you're going to get as good an outcome as you can get without being able to control everything.
James,
Yeah, I think I certainly absolutely sort of echo and endorse what Brett's just outlined. I think certainly that the importance of the right deal team is absolutely crucial within the buyer's organization. I think fundamentally it's not just the CEO's decision. Some of the deals we were involved in, which we sort of tend to see having the best prospect of that longer term success, the buy-side transaction team is much wider than the CEO. It's not just the CEO and finance, it includes ops, it includes HR, it's looking at cultural integration. And so the deal's being looked at through, I suppose, a much wider sort of viewpoint on it. I'd certainly add, in terms of that concept, the illusion of control, the way that we really see that manifest itself in relation to the buyers is often it's how will the customers, the clients of the target react to the transaction when they find out about it post-completion. And often, you see, buyers will have a perspective, they've got a great client proposition, they're acquiring the target, they believe that the target service offering to its clients will be bolstered by the transaction. And so what's not to like for the existing customer base, existing client base? That might not be how the customers and client base actually perceive it. Particularly sort of relevant when you see transactions in sectors where the target is perhaps operating more at an owner-operator sort of level, and so there is that element of independence to the target business. If they're being acquired by a much bigger national international group, that affinity that the customers might feel with that business that they previously bought from might disappear. And as buyers, there's often that illusion of control. We're in control of the business, we're in control of pricing, contract terms, we can keep the customers happy. You have no control over the customer's emotional reaction to the deal. So I certainly think that's sort of the very prevalent example that we see it in relation to that illusion of control. And I think, just as Brett says, we do see all of these biases on transactions manifesting themselves, whether it is buy side or sell side, in one way, shape, or form, when you have I suppose buyers and sellers ultimately working towards the same goal of the transaction completing, but with very different motivating factors along that journey.
Excellent. Should we go to some Q&A? James, I know you were going to kind of moderate the Q&A here, and I do thank people for putting some questions in. I can see here, and please, I would like to encourage everybody to ask some questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the next 15-20 minutes within the hour that we've got.
Yeah, certainly. Let's have a look what we've got. So to kick off, first question is, I suppose, out of all of the biases that identified, discussed, which does the research identify as being the most critical one in conducting M&A deals?
Oh, that's it's a hard one to answer because I'd like to say all of them. And of course, different biases get manifested in different deals at different times in different ways. But I guess it was not by chance that, in fact, I mentioned in the paper that people will see it listed first, the overconfidence bias. It's very interesting within the academic literature in terms of biases. That was the first one that was, that was really discussed and researched. In fact, back in 1986 was the first paper that came out on that one. It was called the hubris hypothesis. Overconfident CEOs, overconfident boards, I think, and also from my experience, probably, is the one bias that in fact one should most protect against. How could one do that? I mean, of course, that's the whole purpose of independent directors, non-executive directors on boards. And most M&A deals would require board approval, even if they're not large enough to require shareholder approval in a large publicly held company. So it really is the role of those independent directors to be, the ones to take these biases into account, but specifically the overconfidence bias, of a, hubristic management team. So, Brett, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that one as well.
In terms of hubristic,
which one's more? Which one you've seen perhaps the most, or which one you think is the most dangerous?
I think the overconfidence one is my view of the most dangerous one, because you can, as I said, right, one of the other points I was making earlier on, you can have an extremely strong personality CEO running that business who has this great idea in the shower in the morning, and it can turn into an absolute disaster over a period of 3 to 6 months in getting the deal done by burning a lot of people and a lot of people's time, but also, living with the consequences of that if that CEO gets fired as a result of that deal. So yeah, I'd say the overconfidence is the most dangerous one, and and you can say that. I mean, if you're an advisor, obviously your incentive is to get the deal done, because otherwise you don't get paid. But what you're trying to do is kind of sift through some of those areas where you can see straight away that you might be the seller, advising a seller, for example, and you can see straight away that you got to sell your business. But if you sell your business like that, you're going to be laughed at because you're just not credible. So you're trying to bring it into a space that both sides get to the point of view where actually this guy talks the same language as me. and you need to make sure that what you're telling them is completely fact-based, because you lose all credibility as an advisor if you don't rely on fact-based advice on both sides, buy and sell side. I mean, sell side, as I said, you only kind of sell the business once. You can be a bit more aggressive with the seller effectively, because you're not going to come back, repeat business. If you're on the buy side, that's where I spend a lot of my time. You need to be ensuring that you're getting good deals for that business. Not only good deals in a financial sense, but also good deals from is this the right fit for that business? Is this going to be a successful thing? Have we done all we can to expose the areas that they need to be thinking about before they buy this business? Because if you get that, you get a good reputation and you get repeat business from buy-side clients. So, I think that's probably the most important one from our perspective, in terms of making sure that what you say you are and what you say you can do, you do, and you're not overselling yourself, because that just gets found out very quickly through the conversations you have on the way in, or the courtship process, as we like to call it, or in due diligence. These things are going to get exposed at some point, and if you're not upfront and honest upfront about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, as I say, you're going to get found out. You're going to waste a lot of people's time and money.
I think that actually leads on to a follow-up question there that's been asked, that's come in, about what role does the due diligence process play in identifying and mitigating that bias. And I suppose that's widen that slightly. I suppose, what can a buyer do, sort of a bit more awareness of these biases? How does a buyer tackle these issues and ensure that they're not being unduly influenced by these unconscious biases? And is the due diligence process an important part of that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think the due diligence process is the one that is most prone to the confirmation bias, where in fact you are using the due diligence process in order to be able to prove that the idea that the CEO and the board have had is in fact the right deal to move forward on. And therefore you're looking for information to confirm those previous preconceptions about that particular deal. And you don't look as hard for the things that might argue against that deal taking place. So that's why the due diligence process itself can be one of the problems in this. And that's, again, why one needs to be aware that the team will have that bias. And even the CEO, him or herself, ought to be asking the questions, what have you found that might argue against the deal? And the CEO, if the CEO is not being too hubristic or overconfident in this case, should be, asking those questions. And if the CEO doesn't ask those questions of the due diligence team, certainly the independent directors, who would be ultimately approving the deal, should be doing that. So,
yeah, I mean,
the other point I guess to say is that very often the due diligence process is being done by outside advisors, because certainly on the buy side, you may be buying into a market or a geography that you don't have previous experience with, and therefore you need to use advisors to be able to dig into that market deeper than you may be able to just on your own. Those advisors ought to be the ones who are looking for that as well. But again, you should be asking the advisors who are doing that due diligence that same question as well, which is not just what have you found to confirm this deal, or what have you found that we're going to be able to use during integration, which of course assumes the deal goes through, but asking the questions about what in fact have you found that might argue against doing this deal. And as I said earlier, building in the circuit breakers into the process to allow yourself to be able to walk away from the deal, without losing as much face as possible.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point as well, it's very, as you said earlier, it's very hard to walk away from a deal at that late stage. You've gone 3 or 4 months into a process, you're into due diligence. So, I mean, you get to letter of intent stage or head of term stage, 80-90% of the time you're probably going to do the deal, regardless of unless something really heinous comes up in the due diligence, like the CEO is a bank robber or something, and they're looking for any reason not to do the deal, if you like. And that's the confirmation sort of point you made. So the same experience, you get most of the sort of the diligence you've done beforehand, pre-due diligence before the LOI gets sent out. And then, as you say, the rest of it is just confirmation, unless there's something horrible found in the due diligence.
I think I'd certainly add on to picking up on the legal side. I think what we sometimes see, it's not particularly common, but we do see it on transactions, and it does perhaps increase the risk of that confirmation bias, is when you are conducting the legal or financial due diligence exercise, and you're still at an early stage in that, and in parallel already starting to negotiate the main transaction documentation, it sort of pushes everybody into that funnel towards completion without the opportunity at that early stage within the due diligence to look for the showstoppers in respect to the transaction. So I think that certainly does lead into that confirmation bias. And I think does just emphasize that point about the due diligence process being a moment to be particularly cautious about these biases and very aware as a buyer what you're looking at as it's looking through. So I suppose, yeah, so the next question, as Scott has been asked, sort of, I suppose particularly relevant for perhaps buyers looking at first acquisition, but do you tend to see all of these points still prevalent, relevant to those serial acquirers of businesses as well as those first-time buyers? Is that, I suppose, are they even greater risk of overconfidence, having advised on transactions previously or been involved in transactions previously?
Yeah, no. Again, very interesting question about the about serial acquirers. Serial acquirers should be able to do a lot better on this, right? Because they've had the experience and perhaps they've made some mistakes and they've made some errors. Unfortunately, serial acquirers can also become very overconfident because if they have done 2 or 3 deals successfully, they think they know the magic sauce. They think they have the magic touch, and that they know how to do M&A deals. Remember, for most companies and for most boards, they may do a couple M&A deals a year, or even one every 2 or 3 years. Serial acquirers themselves, unless you are one of the very, very large, and frequent serial acquirers. And here I'm even excluding the companies that are financial sponsors that, of course, have as their business model acquiring companies, therefore like private equity firms. But for most corporates, this is an occasional activity. They're not expert in doing M&A deals. The serial acquirers get to the point where they think that they're expert, and I think that's where the overconfidence bias comes into play. Ultimately, the odds are going to be that you're going to flip that coin and it's going to come up tails when you thought it was going to come up heads. If you don't do your homework properly, if you don't and aren't cognizant of these biases and therefore take the active steps to make sure to counter these biases, because we all suffer from them. I love the one quote about unconscious biases. The ones about unconscious biases that said that 90% of all car drivers think they are above average drivers. That's the kind of thing that companies who are doing M&A deals, and even more so the serial acquirers, suffer from. So it's even more important for them to be conscious of these biases.
So Brett, and what do you sort of see in practice working with the repeat acquirers? Do you sort of tend to see that manifest itself?
Yeah, I worked for Accenture for a long time, and I saw them buy an awful lot of businesses and their evolution of how they acquire businesses over a long period of time as well. So at the very beginning, they weren't very good at it, frankly, because they were trying to plug everyone into the Accenture way of doing things, right? And the Accenture way of doing things has been great for Accenture for so long, but it wasn't necessarily great for all the companies they were trying to plug into that machinery, if you like. So, but they've got better at it. So, and they acquire probably a company a week globally, but they've got a lot better at it by just learning from their mistakes. I mean, they'll never actually say that they're perfect at it, even now. They're not, believe it or not, that arrogant. But they've just done it through learning from their mistakes. If you're trying to, the reason sometimes you buy a company and you buy an entrepreneur, especially the smaller ones, and they tend to buy tuck-in companies, not big transactions like the IBMs have done with places, things like Red Hat, for example. They buy tuck-ins and they buy entrepreneurs. They buy people that have built successful businesses who know their market intimately, and they want some of that into the business they're being acquired into. And one of the biggest failings that they used to do a lot was on the way into a transaction, because that was it was really transactional, to use that expression. But it was more about how that business was to deliver on the synergies and the business case and all the other good stuff that they invented on the way in, right, in terms of the business case to make the transaction work. And the worst thing we used to do was to suffocate the entrepreneur and say, right, this is how you put in your sum report, this is how you do this is the training course you've got to do. This is what you got to do here. You got to do that. You got to do it this way. And it kind of nullified some of the entrepreneurial spirit that these businesses were being bought for in the first place. And you lose a lot of why they were going to make this part of the business a success. So and then every deal you do is always different in some way on the way in. There's always hair on it. There's always things that are not going to be perfect from the way in. But it's whether you've got the right people on the other side. The guys that are driving these business cases or being sort of buddies for the entrepreneurs coming into the business to help them navigate them through it to make sure they're successful. And if you get that right and your fundamentals are broadly right on the way in, then you're going to have a better chance of having a successful deal at the end of it. That was my view on it.
I think looking at the time, we've probably got time for one. Probably have to be the final question before we wrap up to ensure we're on time. I think probably that one. Looking through the list, I think there's a questions coming about. So obviously, Scott, you've mentioned the three biases that affect the M&A decision making out of, I think it was almost 100 cognitive biases that have been identified by behavioural scientists. For which other biases, apart from the three that we've spoken about today, do you think particularly affect M&A deal making?
That's let me think. Let me just mention three, and we do mention these briefly in the article that that James, I know you can be sending off to people. One of them's already been been kind of alluded to, by the way, with another question which I just see came here, which is about double bottom line transactions. When you begin to look at things like social factors and not just financials, because there's another bias called what's called affect heuristic, and I don't expect you necessarily everybody here to know what that means, from a behavioral science side, but it basically means that you are making decisions based on gut or instinct. And so many people, when they look at the non-financial aspects of a transaction, think that they can go with their gut, that they have a feeling as to how it's going to be and should be, and therefore they make the decision that way without really having the evidence behind it to support that. Now, of course, that's not doing proper due diligence, it's not doing proper analysis, but so many deals I've seen, people are going with their gut on it as well, on that. The second one is an information availability bias, that you can't get all the information that you want. In due diligence, you want every question answered. You can't. So therefore, you go with those that are easy to answer in order to be able to get the information, rather than spending more time, on trying to get those things that aren't easily available. So, having something that you know about already or having something that's easily available can actually introduce a very significant bias on that. And then the last one to mention, but it relates principally to the pricing side of a deal, is anchoring. If you're buying a public company, there's a market capitalization of that company out there publicly available. And if you start off with that figure, you automatically are anchoring your impression of what the appropriate price should be and what the value of that company should be to that price. And if there's not a public value, there might be in the conversations with a private CEO. If I'm selling a company, they might be offering themselves, within a range or even with a particular price. Or somebody in the conversation starts off by saying, well, what do you think you're worth? Or we are looking at what the multiples might be on public deals and applying it against the earnings, of a private company. This is all using information to anchor a particular price from which you build off of, which introduces a bias right away. I mean, this is no different than, going to a bazaar, somewhere in the Middle East and trying to buy a carpet, and the seller will always start off by saying that's going to cost you €1,000, and that anchors, in fact, the price on that in exactly the same way. And the same thing happens with M&A deals as well. So let me stop with those three. As I said, there are 100. Of course, many of those overlap with each other, as these all overlap as well. But it does show that there's so many instances of all these biases coming into play, in these deals. So.
Okay, thanks for that, Scott. I think Scott, we have one final poll to run just to wrap things up. Right. So, and that is so. Yes, the final poll of the webinar is on. I suppose a question of everybody who's joined us today is which of the three biases discussed today do you think has the most impact on the deal success? So that should be popping up now. So do let us know your thoughts on that one. And it's just looking at those results coming in. So yeah, I think we've now got sort of most answers. So yeah, it seems to be a fairly even split between overconfidence and confirmation bias at the moment, with illusion control coming into play. So overconfidence bias looks to be the one identified by most attendees. So interesting.
Well, I hope I haven't introduced an unconscious bias by first talking about overconfidence bias, then confirmation bias, and then illusion of control, or that our list hasn't biased that as well. But it does show how we may, be impacted by that. But I would not disagree with that. And as I say, it was not by chance that we even did them in that order. So very interesting to see that result, at least confirming that if people were trying to counter their unconscious biases while they were answering the poll.
Okay, well, I think with that, I think there's probably just time to say a big thank you to Scott for joining us, and to Brett and the team at PCP for all of their support in today's webinar. We hope that everybody who's joined us has gleaned some useful insights. I know I certainly have from Scott, and we'll be emailing the white paper out following the conclusion of this webinar. If you do have any follow-up questions, apologies, we have lots and lots of questions coming in. We got to as many as we could. So sorry to those who asked questions that we didn't get a chance to respond to. If you do have any follow-up queries or questions, do get in touch with us. And I think that will say good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. James, thanks for organizing it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.